So enough of the last 2 years, on to today. Our first panel today will take us on a lightning-fast journey through 200 years of the history of the Legislative Council. To introduce and explore those 200 years of history in greater detail, it's my pleasure to introduce our first two speakers of the day, Professor Rodney Smith and Professor Frank Bongiorno. Rodney Smith is Professor of Australian Politics at the University of Sydney. He is a former president of the Australian Political Studies Association. He's written numerous academic articles, chapters and books on aspects of New South Wales politics, including the Legislative Council. Notably, he's the author of the book Against the Machines, Minor Parties and Independents in New South Wales, 1910 to 2006, and is co-editor of the book From Carr to Keneally, Labor in Office in New South Wales, 1995 to 2011. Frank Bongionno, AM, is Professor of History at the Australian National University and Distinguished Fellow of the Whitlam Institute at Western Sydney University. He is author of Dreamers and Schemers, A Political History of Australia, and co-author of A Little History of the Australian Labor Party. Frank is President of the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences and a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia and the Australian Academy of Humanities. He's immediate past President of the Australian Historical Association and former Head of School of History at ANU. We are really fortunate to have such outstanding speakers with us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Professors Smith and Bongiorno.
Great, thanks so much, David. And I'd like to associate myself with the acknowledgements of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to people, elders and country. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Ben Franklin as President of the Council, Mr David Blunt, AM, as Clerk of the Legislative Council, and Ms Janelle Moore as Usher of the Black Rod, and the Legislative Council team for the opportunity to participate in what I think has been a wonderful series. So congratulations on bringing us through to the final instalment too. Yes. The New South Wales Legislative Council began as a nominated body in 1824, as we just heard. It had a very brief interregnum of really just a little bit more than a dozen years between 1843 and 1856, when it was 2/3 elected and 1/3 appointed, and then had a long career as an appointed or nominated upper house in a bicameral parliament. Indirect election by parliamentarians was introduced in 1933 and popular election only in 1978. The Legislative Council of New South Wales is today a modern chamber that performs a role often associated with upper houses in bicameral parliaments on the Westminster model. It acts as a genuine house of review, helped, I think, by an electoral system that militates against major party domination. Now, what I want to show today is that the institutional design of the New South Wales Parliament during the main period, in which I'm going to be discussing it, that's 1856 to 1933, mattered enormously, not only for the Parliament itself, and here I'm sort of sticking my neck out a bit, but I think for the wider political culture of New South Wales. And I'm going to make that case in part through comparison with my home state, Victoria, which adopted a very different design from the outset and retained the essentials of that design deep into the 20th century, as of course the New South Wales Council did with respect to its own original design. Now, when New South Wales adopted responsible government in the mid-1850s, its constitution provided for a nominated upper house. There you The story of its adoption is dominated, I think, to a great extent by the controversy that attached to William Charles Wentworth's suggestion of a colonial nobility that would be created to inhabit it. Or, to put it more accurately, that story is dominated by Daniel Dennehy's famous ridicule of the idea of a bunyip aristocracy. The term is still with us, isn't it? But Dennehy's ridicule has unfortunately overshadowed the reality that Wentworth was actually grappling with a genuine problem. Following Westminster precedent, the idea that the Parliament should be bicameral certainly held sway. I mean, there was some flirtation with some groups in New South Wales with the idea of a unicameral Parliament. They accepted, certainly by the mid-1850s, it was going to be bicameral. But then it was unclear what the role of a colonial upper house, or colonial upper chamber, would be in such a system. There were no lords, there were no bishops of an established church. What would it be? What would it do? What was it for? How should it be constituted? If, as some argued, it was to function as a check on hasty legislation, who was the judge? Who was to judge what would be considered hasty? Ill-advised. Now, those who called themselves Liberals in the colony generally favoured an elected council, while Conservatives tended to favour a nominated one. Even once responsible government came, ministries occasionally introduced bills from time to time designed to make the upper house elective, but these, without exception, failed. New South Wales settled on an upper chamber whose members would be appointed by the governor on the nomination of the premier. Liberals worked out soon enough, to their relief, that such a chamber would be amenable to pressure from the public and the government of the day. So they had only limited interest once they sorted that out and that had dawned on them in actually changing it. And that's, I think, why it survives through to the 1930s in that original form. And the early, rather conservative members of the council were also in a particularly precarious situation, a point that's often forgotten. Under the original constitution, the first council was only to be temporary, with a 5-year lifespan. In 1861, new members would be appointed. They would have their positions not for 5 years, but for life. So here was a grand opportunity for an astute government to direct matters in a way that would suit it. There was a kind of axe, if you like, hanging over the original council. Now, the hour called forth the man, Charles Cowper, although he was already experienced in parliamentary and public affairs. He'd been a member of the original partly elected Legislative Council back in 1843. Now, Cowper would go on to become 5-time Premier of New South Wales, and after Wentworth, I think, was the most formidable politician of his time. He was ostensibly a supporter of an elected Legislative Council. One of his ideas was that you'd have manhood suffrage, that is, all men would be able to vote, but that there would be a fairly stiff property qualification for those qualified to actually sit in the upper house. But he also came to see in that idea a danger to his own power, for it might lead to more radical or democratic Liberals getting voted in, politicians who shared the views of men such as Dennehy, who I've already mentioned, as well as Henry Parkes, who will be familiar to most of you. Cowper was, after all, a conservative Liberal, and he saw the chance to use the 1861 expiry of the old council membership to make that council more suited to his own purposes. The council, in its early years, had been claiming the right to alter money bills, budget or appropriation bills, and Cowper wasn't having any of that. Such a claim, if conceded, would undermine the authority of every government, including his own. But Cowper, with his colleague John Robertson, had land legislation that the government was desperate to get through the Parliament, the so-called Selection Acts, which would permit farmers to take up land currently occupied under pastoral leases by, if you like, the old squattocracy. Now, in order to achieve that goal of land legislation, popular with voters, overwhelmingly supported by the Legislative Assembly, Cowper was determined to clean out the council, ridding it of its most intransigent elements, but ensuring that the cure would not be worse than the disease. That is, he didn't want a council made up of men of the likes of Dennehy and Parkes. The Premier, of course, could not do all this unilaterally. The Governor at the time, Sir John Young, was to all intents and purposes a representative of the Colonial Office in London, appointed by and reporting directly to the Secretary of State, and a de facto guardian of the interests of the British government, a bit like a kind of diplomat, a British diplomat, if you like, in Australia. And, of course, very significant among the duties of such a man was the protection of British investors. Now, he had instructions from London to reappoint the old council, and he had already refused a request from Cowper for 15 new members. But under the system of self-government or responsible government established in the mid-1850s, the governor was also the representative of the Crown, or a sort of monarchical figure in a constitutional monarchy. So he was expected to act on the advice of his New South Wales ministers, who were in turn responsible to the Parliament, the system that we're still familiar with today. By Westminster Convention, it was the lower house, the Assembly, from which the executive derived. It needed to have the confidence of the Legislative Assembly, even if a cabinet might include members of the Legislative Council. But the Constitution of New South Wales also gave the two houses very nearly equal powers. Now, the old council was due to expire on the 13th of May 1861. Just before this date, the council amended Cowper and Robertson's land bill to protect the tenure of large landholders, and they sent it back to the Assembly. The government, which rejected these amendments from the council, then just had the Assembly vote on it, and of course the Assembly voted in favour of the government's version of the land bill. Cowper then asked Young to appoint 21 new members of the Legislative Council. You can see how this game worked. Cowper's methods were subtle. His biographer, Alan Powell, says he had no intention of allowing these 21 actually to sit in the council. The object was rather to provoke a resignation of the council president and a walkout of the other Conservatives, and they did their duty as far as Cowper was concerned. 20 of them did indeed walk out of the Legislative Council to prevent those new nominees from being sworn in. Cowper's aim was to discredit the old council with the Assembly, with voters, so that the governor would be unable simply to reappoint them to the newly constituted council in 1861. So when the new members of the council were selected by a committee that also included William Charles Wentworth, just back from England, Cowper got the appointments that he wanted. Now, what did he want? Well, he wanted men who were liberal, and it was all men we're talking about in this period, as I'll mention later. He wanted men liberal enough to pass his land bills, but conservative enough not to give him in the council the kind of trouble that people like Parkes and Dennehy were already giving him in the Assembly. He was walking a tightrope. But it was masterly politics. No wonder they called him Slippery Charlie. Wentworth also came up with an informal agreement as a part of this process that swamping in the future would only occur if, after a dissolution of the Assembly and an election over a vital issue like a land bill, the council continued to stand in the way of a bill. So what we can see here is the emergence of a set of kind of rules or conventions. It was called the Gentleman's Agreement, by which these two chambers would relate to one another. Now, Cowper had every reason to like this particular idea, and with the help of Wentworth as the new president of the council, he got his land bills through soon enough, and he even managed to see off the public clamour for an elective council through delaying tactics. So he retained the ability, the right, to nominate new members of the council, something he wanted to keep because he had seen how well it could work. Now, Cowper's tactics had resulted in a complete triumph. He'd gotten rid of the most conservative council nominees, he'd established the supremacy of the Assembly over the council, the government, of course, over the council, He'd preserved a nominee chamber composed in a way that posed no threat to his government or indeed a threat to any future government. The council, it seemed, could be a nuisance to a government, but it could not be a destroyer. Cowper had headed off any prospect of an elective body and so set the course for the next 70 years of parliamentary history in New South Wales. He'd also set a precedent, though, for how future governments would deal with a council that stood in the way of its program. There you have Henry Parkes, the great factional leader and then free trade leader, late 1880s and 1890s, and there his great rival of the 1890s, George Reid. And it's Reid I'd like to talk about here. Reid succeeded Parkes as Free Trade Party leader and became New South Wales Premier in 1894. Now, with a divided protectionist opposition, Reid had a safe majority, but he also gained the support of the Labor Party, founded just a few years before. Reid's program included the reduction of tariffs on most imported goods and their replacement as a source of government revenue by land and income taxes. Now he ran into council obstruction. Rich landowners did not want land or income taxes. Reid argued that there were constitutional principles at stake. The council was seeking to dictate to the government and to the Assembly on financial policy, which he thought a breach of Westminster Convention, that upper houses should not seek to control public revenue. Reid responded to this obstruction by calling an election, which he won overwhelmingly. The council's position was now weaker, but it still sought amendments to the income and land tax proposals that Reid found unacceptable. A conference between managers of the two chambers went on over 4 days in November 1895, but the council still refused to give way. Now, there was little progress during the first 2 days of that meeting, but then over the weekend, Reid went and visited Government House. He didn't really do anything else. He just visited Government House. What was he up to? Reid, of course, with his considerable frame, was dropping a hint. If the council refused to budge, his visit suggested, he would ask the governor to appoint enough new members to force it to budge. In other words, to swamp it. It was body language, if you like. He needed to say nothing. Now, the council started to, all of a sudden, on day 3, to act more reasonably, and compromises were agreed. Hey presto, Reid had his taxation bills through. His methods, you'll notice, were not so very far from Cowper's several decades earlier. Just as Cowper, in the early 1860s, had tried to avoid giving too much encouragement to the radicals of his day, in the 1890s, Reid had no intention of pressing a more aggressive approach to the Legislative Council's powers, really trying to reduce their powers, which is, of course, what the Labor Party, his allies, would have liked. So they're always managing both the council on the one side and the radicals to their own left on the other. In any case, Reid managed to get the Coal Mines Regulation Bill and a Factories and Shops Bill through the council as well. Labor disliked Reid's acceptance of council amendments in each case, but something was better than nothing. Labor's experience of Legislative Council obstruction during this 1890s era of their support for the Reid ministry meant that by 1898, the New South Wales Labor Party had adopted abolition of the Legislative Council as the first plank in its fighting platform. Now, the persistence of an appointed upper chamber, I believe, had significant effects on the political culture of New South Wales that are best indicated through a comparison with Victoria. The southern colony had an elected Legislative Council with a very high property qualification, both to vote and to stand, indeed much higher to stand than to vote, but they were both very high. All up, there were only 10,775 qualified voters in the colony in 1856. That was a colony of 325,000 people. By way of contrast, the Assembly had manhood suffrage as early as 1858. Now, later reforms would reduce the council thresholds mildly, But the upper house was a stronghold for the wealthy in Victoria for about 2 decades after responsible government, and it remained a conservative bulwark until at least the middle of the 20th century. The council could not be dissolved, and its obstruction could not be overcome by any constitutional means. Come back to him. Victoria had 2 great constitutional crises in the 19th century that resulted directly from these arrangements. You'll notice there was no equivalent of these in New South Wales. The first was between 1865 and 1871, triggered by the 1865 budget of James McCulloch. The ministry tacked a tariff proposal onto its budget bill, and the council responded by refusing to pass block supply. Through the second half of the 1860s, there was continuing conflict between the Assembly and the Council in Victoria. Elections would be called and won handsomely by the ministry, which gained overwhelming endorsement from voters each time, and the council paid absolutely no attention to the results of those elections. Unlike the New South Wales Council, it could not be swamped, so it could not be coerced. There were overflowing protest meetings. Partisans abused one another in the streets. Death threats were issued. A visiting Englishman, Charles Dilke, wrote, and I quote, "Class animosity runs much..." He was there visiting during this crisis. "Class animosity runs much higher and drives roots far deeper into private life in Victoria than in any other English-speaking country I have seen. Political men of distinction are shunned by their opponents in the streets and clubs. I have seen men refuse to sit down to dinner with a statesman whose views on land questions they happened to dissent. From whose views on land questions they happened to dissent." George Hickenbotham, McCulloch's fiery Attorney-General, helped turn the controversy into one about the rights of self-government after the Colonial Office dismissed the Governor, Charles Darling, on the grounds of an alleged favouritism towards the McCulloch ministry. Now, the period 1877 to 1881 saw another great constitutional crisis. The trigger this time was an effort by the Liberal government of Graham Berry, in the middle there, to place payment of members of Parliament on a permanent basis. He again used the method of tacking this proposal onto a budget bill. And this conflict again raised the spectre of civil strife. On one day early in January 1878, called Black Wednesday, the government dealt with the problem of having no money by sacking senior public servants and even some judges. The conflict continued for years. Again, the Assembly was unable to modify the Legislative Council's formidable power, and the latter chamber, the Council, would go on to mutilate or defeat many a bill in the decades ahead, not only during this crisis. To take just one example, Victoria was a colony with a vigorous women's suffrage movement, but it had to wait until 1908, the last of the states, before it granted the vote to all adults. And that was largely to do with Legislative Council obstruction. The institutional design of Victoria's Parliament, with its popularly elected lower house and rigidly conservative upper house, promoted party organisation with a modern look about it a good decade before parties came to New South Wales. 1877 in Victoria compared with 1887 here. New South Wales retained until then what has been called a factional system in which wheeling and dealing and fluidity of allegiance were prominent. I'd argue that this had much to do with the way the New South Wales system promoted compromise and deal-making. Governments not only came and went as groupings formed and then broke up, the vulnerability of the Legislative Council to pressure produced a wider culture of negotiation and compromise. Of course, conflicts occurred, but everyone knew that a government had the means of persuasion at its disposal that councils could only ignore at their peril. They always were threatened with the possibility of being swamped by new members. On the whole, the mere existence of such powers could induce some degree of cooperation, however reluctant, as both Cowper and Reid had demonstrated. In Victoria, there was no such mechanism. The Legislative Council could resist governments completely and indefinitely. The result was a colonial political order subject to periodic crises that reached down into everyday life and social relations. It's hard not to wonder if that also did not help to give Victorian political life its sharper ideological edge compared with the whatever it takes culture of New South Wales pragmatism. That's where I'm sticking my neck out. That the New South Wales Legislative Council remained a nominated body in a fundamentally democratic political culture was a vulnerability too. But when Labor actually began to win lower house majorities from 1910, council abolition hardly seemed the most pressing issue on the agenda. Labor had only 5 or 6 loyalists there who were outnumbered by about 50 others. Indeed, William Holman's failure after 1913, while Labor Premier, to make Labor appointments to the council so that his party could pursue its abolition, became a major point of contention between him and the wider Labor movement. It would eventually culminate in the split over conscription, which was followed by Holman appointing 23 Conservative members to the Legislative Council to bolster his position. None of this, of course, did much to sort of add to the legitimacy of the chamber that had often obstructed Labor policy between 1910 and 1916. And indeed, it paved the way for the more vigorous efforts, which I'm sure we'll hear about from Professor Smith in a moment, of Jack Lang to secure the abolition of the council. So did the nominated chamber have any advantages over a body elected in the manner of the Victorian Legislative Council? The benefits or otherwise of nominated bodies is kind of a dead issue in Australia because we don't have them. Of course, it remains very much alive in relation to House of Lords reform in the United Kingdom. But look, what I've done here is just very briefly, here are 5 members of the Legislative Council during the sort of later 19th and early 20th century. And without going into great detail, you can see the kinds of attributes that they brought. We have Andrew Garran there over on the left, the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, picturesque atlas of Australia, high legal qualifications, and was appointed on 2 different occasions by Parkes and later by George Reid. You have there John Peden, Challis Professor of Law at the University of Sydney, who brought massive legal expertise to the Legislative Council and was a major influence on legislative affairs, eventually becoming its president. Charles McKellar, medical doctor, most famous or infamous perhaps for his role in the Royal Commission into the decline of the birth rate, but more generally someone who grappled with the problems of public health and social welfare. Fred Flowers for the Labor Party, who eventually became president, and Edward Kavanagh went on from the Legislative Council to perform major roles within the industrial relations or arbitration system and in the Commonwealth bureaucracy during the Second World War. You'll notice there are no women here. During Flowers' period as president, a bill went through making them eligible to sit in the Legislative Council, and 5 years later, the second Lang government would appoint 2 women, Catherine Green and Ellen Webster. But my suggestion here is that these kinds of legislative councils were probably less likely to pop up in an upper chamber that was an elective one, where it was still seen as a kind of political body in a way that could be partly elided through the nominated system that existed in New South Wales. So to finish, the Legislative Council was an ambiguous contributor to New South Wales democracy in the period up to 1924 in light of its nominated status. Nonetheless, it was absorbed into a democratic culture and probably played a more useful role than the elected Victorian chamber as a genuine house of review. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. I'll take over. I also want to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation on whose lands we meet, and elders past, present and emerging, and any other First Nations peoples who are here. And thank all of those who organised this conference. I want to take up the second 100 years, that's my task. And I'm going to focus on the politics of this more recent period and try not to get too much involved in the constitutional and electoral changes because they're the subject of later sessions today. Now, the second 200 years was, second 100 years of the council is often a turbulent period. Despite its survival in the 1920s and 1930s, throughout the first half of this period, the council, it seems to me, struggled to define a clear role for itself. And in the past 5 decades, I would argue, we've seen the period where it's developed into a pluralistic chamber with a strong institutional culture of legislative review and executive scrutiny, but that also has brought its challenges and conflicts. So I just want to skip through the 100 years and pull out some themes from different periods. I want to start with the 1920s and 1930s. I don't want to say too much about abolition because I'd rather talk about what the council has done than what might have occurred had it been abolished, but we need to address abolition. And abolition was driven by Jack Lang's reform agenda. So the Lang government from 1925 had a strong labour agenda, the introduction of widows' pensions, child support, the 44-hour working week under state awards, workers' compensation and so on. And the council resisted much of this. As Frank's mentioned, abolition of the council was part of Labor's platform, but as Frank also mentioned, it wasn't an element in the platform that had been vigorously pursued prior to Lang, and Lang himself didn't mention it in his 1925 election speeches. It wasn't something that was top of Lang's agenda during that election. Unlike Queensland, the 1925 attempts to abolish the council famously failed when 2 of the members who'd been appointed to the council for that purpose crossed the floor and voted with the non-Labor MLCs, and 5 were absent from the vote. So the effort failed. Lang lost the 1927 election. Thomas Bavin, his replacement, thought we've got to do something about the council. If we don't want it to be abolished, what can we do with it? And he proposed a legislative council of 60 indirectly elected members, that is, members elected by the Legislative Assembly for staggered 12-year terms. So 15 MLCs would be elected in each tranche of 3 years. But Bavin, again, himself didn't pursue this particularly vigorously. There was some uncertainty about whether voters would consider an indirectly chosen Legislative Council a satisfactory outcome of the Nationalists' election promise to remodel the Legislative Council on an elective basis. You know, would the voters countenance the idea that an indirectly elected council was fulfilment of that election promise to establish the Legislative Council on an elective basis? And there was additionally some question about whether this was the right time, whether the Depression, with all of its social and economic upheaval, was really the period for constitutional reform. Bavin, in turn, loses the 1930 election, bringing Lang back into power, the Labor Party back into power. There are new swamping efforts by Lang. They're unsuccessful because of resistance by the governors and so on. And Lang finds himself increasingly occupied or preoccupied with other matters until his famous dismissal by Governor Game and the loss of the 1932 election. So abolition fails. Bertrand Stephens becomes Premier and in 1932 implements Legislative Council reform along the lines suggested earlier by Bavin. So from 1932 to 1978, we have a chamber that is indirectly elected, that is elected on a proportional basis by the members of the Legislative Assembly. So the status of the Legislative Council appears to be settled. It's established. It's not going to be abolished, or at least not easily. It's going to require a referendum to do that. It's shifted towards a more democratic, if you like, or more responsive to the people, albeit indirectly, via those people electing members of the Legislative Assembly, the lower house basis. But is its status really settled? As an indirectly elected chamber, it seems to me, for this whole period, 1932 to 1978, the chamber often struggled to define a clear role for itself in a modern democracy. And there are a number of suggestions as to why it might be seen as an appropriate house for such a democracy. One is the idea that the Legislative Council would be a house of review, or was a house of review, or a house of quote-unquote second thoughts. That the Legislative Assembly, the government of the day, would propose legislation. The Legislative Council's role was to review that, to give it a second thought, to see whether that legislation was appropriate, was going to be effective, and so on. And this was associated with the idea of the Legislative Council's part-time nature. It wasn't seen as a co-equal house with the Legislative Assembly, which was full-time. It was rather seen as a sort of second chamber that was a supplement to that Legislative Assembly, despite, as Frank has mentioned, its quite extensive constitutional powers. And this was reinforced by the fact that legislative councillors, not all of them, but many of them didn't attend sessions on a regular basis, didn't participate in legislative debates if they did attend, and there was little committee work or other legislative activity beyond the meetings of the council. So was it really a house of review or a house of second thoughts? Another idea was that it would be a break on revolutionary measures, quote unquote. Again, this is where the revolutionary measures come from, arguably not from the Labor Party, but potentially perhaps from the Labor Party. So this idea that the Legislative Council was a conservative break on revolutionary measures that it could resist, or extreme measures was seen as acting as a break on popular fancies that might overwhelm the electorate. They elect a radical government, and without a Legislative Council, you'd end up with some kind of revolutionary chaos. But then what counts as extreme? Who's to define extreme? One person's extreme measure might be another person's reasonable reform. A third idea was that the council, therefore, should allow the government to implement its mandate, quote unquote. In other words, it wouldn't obstruct anything that the governing party had said it would do during the election campaign, but should be prepared to scrutinise and, if necessary, reject legislation for which the government didn't have an obvious mandate. Now, this was never, it should be said, Labor's position in the Legislative Council, and it also should be said it was very inconsistently applied by the non-Labor MLC. So this idea that mandated legislation is fine, non-mandated legislation was fair game for rejection by the Legislative Council, again, didn't particularly well define its practice. Was it a house of expertise or a house that was more diverse than the Legislative Assembly? Ken Turner, in his fine book, House of Review, published in 1969 by the University of Sydney Press, and definitely required reading for anyone who's interested in the history of the council in this period, casts doubt on this. There certainly were some experts within the Legislative Council in particular fields. There was also some diversity. As Frank mentions, there were some women appointed to the Legislative Council. The practice of what we would now call, I guess, duty members of the Legislative Council, in other words, members of the Legislative Council who effectively looked after geographic areas of the state of New South Wales where their own party wasn't particularly well represented in the Legislative Assembly, also developed. But the council had a quite narrow expertise. It was dominated by urban and rural business owners, so farmers, graziers, business people, lawyers and trade union officials. Fairly narrow range of expertise. It was never particularly diverse in its socioeconomic composition. Was it a non-partisan House? The mythology around this is perhaps stronger than any of the other points, maybe other than the idea that it was a House of Review. In fact, the Labor and country parties had no particular qualms about acknowledging party within the Legislative Council. The idea that the Legislative Council was a non-partisan House in comparison to the partisan bear pit of the Legislative Assembly largely rests on the Liberal Party and its predecessors' reluctance to acknowledge party in the Legislative Council. These non-Labor MLCs, led by Sir Henry Manning, were very slow to acknowledge party. The Liberal Party avoided pre-selections for Legislative Council seats until 1961. Manning rejected the title of opposition leader that was available to him. His successor, Sir Hector Clayton, the United Australia Party, accepted the title, who originally from the United Australia Party, but sat as an independent in the Legislative Council, accepted the rather gorgeous title, I think, Principal Representative of those members who are not supporters of the government. I'm not the opposition leader. I'm the principal representative of those members who are not supporters of the government in 1960. But the Liberal Party and predecessors were slow to accept the idea of party in the Legislative Council. But as Ken Turner points out in his book, there is a distinct difference in the level of scrutiny, legislative scrutiny of the council when it is under controlled by the same party that controls the Legislative Assembly, and when it's under the control of a different party to the party in control of the Legislative Assembly. In other words, when the party in the Legislative Council is not the party that dominates the Legislative Council, is not the party of government. 1934 to 1941, 1949 to 1959, 1961, periods when either Labor dominates both houses or non-Labor dominates both houses, the Legislative Council activity, its amendments to bills, its scrutiny of bills and so on, declines quite markedly. Where the two houses are divided, 1941 to 1949, again 1959 to 65, 1965 to 67, there's more activity. So partisanship is clearly in operation even when not acknowledged. So in summary, between the 1930s and 1978, the record of the Legislative Council as a House of Review was very patchy, and perhaps Ken Turner's lukewarm praise of the Legislative Council in this period as having a quote-unquote useful record of undramatic tidying up of legislation is the best that can be said. To the extent that members of the Legislative Council cared about this, they struggled to define a satisfactory role for themselves. Retain and reform was always the rallying cry against further attempts at abolition, notably the rather lacklustre Labor push in 1960 and the referendum of 1961 to abolish the council, which failed. But what sort of reform? What was the appointed council, the indirectly elected council, to be replaced by? 1978 resolves that issue, and arguably it's the kind of true start of a democratic legislative council. So if in 4 years' time people are so minded, we could come back and have 50 years of the truly democratic legislative council. Just a suggestion. I'm not being paid for this gig, by the way. But arguably this is the true start of a democratically elected, directly elected by the people legislative council. So Neville Wran's government in 1978 implements reform to the Legislative Council, reduces the numbers from 60 to 45, with 15 directly elected. I've got that for 4 years, but initially for 3 years and then later for 4 years for 12-year terms, with optional preferential voting in which voters had to indicate at least 10 preferences for the candidates. Now Wran, it has to be said, wasn't the first, or the Labor Party under Wran was not the first group to push for a directly elected Legislative Council with staggered terms. This was suggested at least as early as 1932 in the considerations as to what to do with the Legislative Council, when the idea of a 60-member Legislative Council with 15 Legislative Council members elected every 3 years, plus 15 to be appointed, was mooted. And in 1962, the Liberals, in thinking about what to do once they'd helped to defeat the 1961 referendum campaign to abolish the council, came up with a range of options, including a 36-member Legislative Council with 9 members of the Legislative Council elected every 2 years for 8-year terms. So RAN's implementation was not the first time that a directly elected staggered term Legislative Council had been proposed. Now, neither RAN nor opposition leader at the time, Eric Willis, expected the new Legislative Council to challenge the two-party system. This is an important point. They expected that power in the two houses would be held dually. The governing party of government would also control the Legislative Council, or would be divided along party lines. They didn't anticipate the emergence of minor parties in the Legislative Council. Eric Willis warned that the Labor Party wanted a directly elected council so that it could enact quote-unquote socialist legislation without restraint. After a period of time when people have seen that the legislation is nothing more than a rubber stamp, Labor will persuade them that it's a waste of taxpayers' money and they might as well abolish it. For his part, Neville Wran said, and I quote, "I do not propose to make the Legislative Council a forum for every single issue candidate and every pressure group in this state. That is a sure way to undermine the basic two-party system, which lies at the very heart of the strength of our parliamentary democracy." So neither the Labor Party nor its coalition opponents thought that the Legislative Council elected directly by the people on a proportional basis was going to result in the sort of multi-party system that emerged. And for a decade, this was the case. 1981 saw the first minor party candidates elected to the Legislative Council in the Reverend Fred Nile for the Call to Australia and Elizabeth Kirby for the Australian Democrats. By 1986, Elizabeth Kirby felt she was wasting her time in the Legislative Council. She told the Sunday Telegraph in an interview, "I am irrelevant to this parliament. I can't change anything." And she considered switching to the Senate, trying to run as the lead candidate for the Australian Democrats in the Senate, where the Democrats had held the balance of power since July 1981. So for the first 10 years, Wran and, not Willis perhaps, worrying about Wran and the Labor Party's dominance, but Wran would have been happy with the outcome of the shift to an elected parliament, elected Legislative Council. But then things begin to change. 1988, as many of the more accurate predictors thought would be the case, the minor parties started to hold the balance of power. So from 1988 onwards, the minor parties begin to hold the balance of power in the Legislative Council, and the major party of government never gets it back. Interestingly, it is minor parties, it's not independents who are important here. So the statewide election means independents don't get any purchase on the Legislative Council elections. No one's well known enough across the state to run on their own. The form of the ballot encourages people to run under party tickets. And this change, this shift with the minor parties holding the balance of power and gradually extending their presence in the Legislative Council fundamentally changes Legislative Council politics, although it doesn't do so overnight. Initially, the effects are felt on legislation and scrutiny of the executive rather than institutional changes such as the development of the committee system that we see today. So between 1988 and 1991, for example, the Australian Democrats in particular pushed hard for amendments to key planks of the Greiner government's legislative agenda, particularly in areas like industrial relations. So in 1989, for example, negotiations on the Workers' Compensation Bill saw the Minister for Industrial Relations, John Fahey, more or less camped outside the offices of Elizabeth Kirby, trying to convince her to, and Richard Jones, the fellow Democrat, to switch their position and support the government's legislation. On the main Industrial Relations Bill in 1990 and cognate bills, negotiations with the Democrats dragged on so long that the bill was extended into the second term of the Greiner government after the 1991 election. And it was only after 484 amendments were passed in the Legislative Council, 484, that the bill got through. During this time, John Fahey, a member of the Legislative Assembly, sought leave to appear and did appear in the Legislative Council to answer questions and to explain elements of the bill. So we can see in this period the minor parties teaming up with the opposition to make life hard in terms of scrutiny of government legislation, regardless of whether or not the government has a mandate for that legislation. I mean, clearly the Greiner government had some kind of mandate for this legislation, but that didn't stop Labor, not surprisingly, but also didn't stop the Democrats from saying, well, we can amend this legislation where we think, or attempt to amend it where we see it's deficient. Now, defeat on legislation tempted the government to achieve some changes via regulation. This was used particularly notably by Michael Yabsley in the area of corrective services. So what you can't get through by legislation, you get through by regulation, existing regulations. And the Democrats responded to this by reviving the practice of disallowing regulations. And so the government again felt itself being pushed back by the presence of the Democrats, in particular in the Legislative Council. 1991 to 1995, the second period of the Greiner and then Fahey government, saw the Legislative Council establish implicit limits to its perceived capacity to keep the executive accountable. You'll remember during this time, I would imagine, the controversy around the appointment of Terry Metherell to a senior public service position and the subsequent resignation of Premier Greiner and Minister Moore over that issue. In 1992, the Legislative Council considered a motion censuring Nick Greiner's minority coalition government over the appointment. This was defeated in the council. So the Legislative Council since has passed censure motions in one or two individual ministers, but 1992, the events of 1992 established that it was the Legislative Assembly, not the Legislative Council, to which ministers and governments ultimately were responsible. 1995 to 1999 saw a more complex Legislative Council. It was a council now not of 45 but of 42. This was the election following the election of the Labor government under Bob Carr, and in this council Labor held 17 seats to the coalition's 18, and the crossbench had expanded, or the crossbench expanded, so it was no longer Call to Australia or the Christian Democrats, Fred Niles' party, and the Australian Democrats, but there was now one Green MLC, one Shooters Party MLC, one Better Future for Our Children MLC, the Australian Democrats, Kirby and Jones split, Franca Arena exited the Labor Party, Helen Shamho exited the Liberal Party, and we now had by the end of that period, had a crossbench of 9 in the Legislative Council, a much more fluid council than the simpler division of earlier times. And in this period, there were two developments which strengthened the Legislative Council in its legislative and executive scrutiny roles. The first was the development of committees, the committee system. This didn't start, or much of this didn't start in the council itself. It began in the period of minority government in the Legislative Assembly, when the three non-aligned independents held the balance of power, and as part of their efforts to reform, Parliament introduced or helped introduce a range of new committees in the Legislative Assembly. These developments had varying levels of success, but they were picked up in the Legislative Council. In particular, the estimates committees, which hadn't worked particularly well in the form under which they were introduced in the Legislative Assembly, were picked up in the Legislative Council. Those committees have developed over time until now we have 8 portfolio committees in the Legislative Council covering the various portfolio responsibilities of ministers and acting as estimates committees as well as general issue type committees. That development, the development which we now see today in those 8 portfolio committees, began with the Legislative Council taking up an idea pioneered not terribly successfully in the Legislative Assembly in that period of minority government. So this period sees the development of the committee system. The second development, which I won't say too much about because I'm sure it'll be discussed later today and it's already been alluded to, is the rise of orders for the production of state papers, which begins in this period, and again, not initially in the Legislative Council, but in the Legislative Assembly, where there are 14 orders for state papers during the period of minority government, reviving a practice that had really disappeared in both houses for a long time. In the Legislative Council, there was only one instance of orders for the production of state papers between 1936 and 1990, but from 1999 onwards, beginning with an opposition motion to order the production of state papers in relation to ministerial decisions over the Lake Cowell gold mine, we've seen the expansion of these powers. We've seen them tested in the courts and upheld in the courts. And again, jumping forward to 2023-24, according to the latest Legislative Council annual report, there were 45 orders for papers agreed to in that period, in that yearly period. Now that was fewer than in immediately previous parliaments, but still a significant indicates still a significant level of scrutiny of executive decision making. I want to finish just by talking briefly about the period 1999 to 2003, which is the last attempt to kind of control or rein in the Legislative Council. It was largely a reaction by the major parties to their loss of control of the Legislative Council. 1995 saw the election of small parties on ticket votes. 1999 saw the famous tablecloth election, which saw the crossbench again expand, parties elected with very small proportions of the vote. No doubt more will be said about this later today. And so the Labor government and the coalition opposition decided something needed to be done about this. Again, I won't talk about the electoral reforms that resulted and the reforms to party registration that resulted, but the key element of this that didn't occur was the idea that a new deadlock mechanism for resolving disagreements between the two houses should be introduced that would severely reduce the Legislative Council's ability to successfully press for amendments against government legislation. This would have basically seen the Legislative Assembly be able to wait out any Legislative Council amendments and then press on with the bill in its initial form, much like the House of Lords, House of Commons arrangement in the United Kingdom. For a while, it looked like both of the major party groupings would agree on this, But the coalition had second thoughts when it realised that the first beneficiary of this would be the Carr Labor government, and it thought the better of that in terms of short-term tactics, if you like, or short-term strategy rather than the long-term benefit that might accrue after it got back into powers. So that really was the last significant occasion on which the Legislative Council's powers, if you like, have been seriously challenged. Since then, since the early 2000s, the pattern of expanded Legislative Council activity has continued. Some minor parties have continued and grown, such as the New South Wales Greens. Others have disappeared after a very relatively brief appearance. Think of the Unity Party. Does anyone remember the Unity Party? A party formed around a multicultural platform in response to the One Nation Party. The One Nation Party itself has had an intermittent presence in the Legislative Council. The 2023 election saw, after 42 years, the end of the Conservative Christian Democratic Party, formerly called To Australia. The first time since 1981, pardon me, that there'd been no organised conservative Christian presence in the council. But at the same time, 2023 saw two new minor parties in terms of Legislative Council representation, legalised cannabis and the Libertarian Party. So the Legislative Council maintains its dynamism, it maintains its multi-party nature. It certainly has a clearer sense of its place in the New South Wales system of checks and balances and broader democracy, and it appears that it will flourish as a democratic and vibrant institution into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rodney and Frank, for those fascinating presentations. We have 10 minutes for questions, so if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we'll get a roving microphone to you, and we'll check in to see if there's any questions online as well. So who'd like to ask the first question? Yes.
Hello, Clem McIntyre from the University of Adelaide. Thanks both for terrific presentations. Frank, it's more of a comment, I think. I was fascinated by the distinction you were drawing between the political culture, if you like, of New South Wales and Victoria based on the powers of the upper house. And inevitably I started comparing it to my thoughts on South Australia. South Australia's upper house has more in common with the Victorian one in the sense of an elected chamber with a property qualification, and yet the politics in a sense is more common or more similar to the pattern that emerges in New South Wales, with factionalism prevailing for much longer, and the ideological divides that you're identifying, I think, less evident. So I just wonder, I think it's a really interesting model you were drawing. I'm just wondering if you've had a chance to look at other jurisdictions, Western Australia and Tasmania as well, to see whether or not there's something there that you can draw from more deeply.
Yeah, thanks, Clem. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, South Australia was a little bit different from Victoria. Its franchise was much more liberal than the Victorian Legislative Council from the outset, actually. And I mean, you'll notice there were Labor members. In fact, there were Labor members of the South Australian Legislative Council before there were Labor members of the Legislative Assembly, which was a coincidence of the timing of elections. But it does dramatise, I think, that there were certainly differences in the qualifications for both the franchise and to sit in the chamber. Look, the South Australian case, I mean, I'm certainly no expert on South Australian politics. It was a very conservative and I think it has to be said very obstructionist body at times during the Playford years. I mean, it gave him some trouble, actually. And, I wonder whether in the South Australian case the fact that you had an incredibly enduring Conservative government, the Liberal and Country League government there, extending from 1933 through to 65, affects the dynamics of that. Playford was clearly in the ascendant. There was incredibly high levels, I think, of consensus around public policy goals during that period, around industrialisation and so on. And so whilst the council did, cause some difficulty to Playford from time to time, if I remember rightly, over things like maybe the nationalisation of the gas supply and other socialist type policies that he pursued, I think the dynamics in South Australia were a little bit different for probably a range of reasons in a range of different time periods. But yeah, look, I think it'd be really interesting actually to do more of this sort of comparison. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it would. Yeah, I think it's a really good suggestion. I'd like to also do more. What kinds of individuals end up in these councils in elective systems compared to the nominated systems of New South Wales? And of course, Queensland had one too. I think would be really very interesting. And I'm not aware that there's been really detailed stuff done on that actually. Yeah.
Yes, Jeremy.
Thanks. Jeremy Travers, Frank, Rodney, love your work. Sorry, I'm just thinking of the question on the fly. What lessons would you say that the last 200 years have for the Legislative Council of today and the Legislative Council of tomorrow?
You're the last 100.
What lessons? Well, I think a key lesson is that what you start off with isn't what you end up with, right? So, I mean, there's a certain level of institutional rigidity and path dependency, but, there can be breaks and they don't necessarily come when they're first thought of, So, as I was trying to say, the idea of a directly elected Legislative Council is around in the 1920s, 1930s, even on the non-Labor side, but it's not until 4-5 decades later that you get that. So I think that would be if you want to draw a broad lesson about the trajectory of institutions, is that they're often they're often unexpected. Think about again going back to Rann and Willis. Rann clearly didn't have in mind the Legislative Council of today when he was in 1978. He would have, he'd be rolling in his grave, assuming his, developments, occur as a result of those sorts of changes that are beyond the imagination of the people who bring them about, and they open up new possibilities.
Yeah, and very similar, talking about unintended consequences of action in relation to the colonial period where, Liberals and even Radicals favoured elective, they wanted something elective. Conservatives to type sort of wanted something nominated, and then it settles in and each side thinks, oh, gee, that's not what I expected. And so, eventually you have, those who are kind of on the Liberal side saying, it's probably better to have a nominated a council. Those on the Conservative side, suddenly see, gee, that wasn't such a great idea after all. What is striking though is if you have the right kind of mechanisms for how that's constituted. Now, we're not going to have nominated bodies of that sort in Australia today. There is the potential for House of Review. I mean, I would argue that the nominated council was probably, particularly from your account, Rodney, I mean, the nominated council might have been better at being a House of Review than what followed from the 1930s, because it was able to incorporate forms of expertise, at least, that I suspect you're not going to get through what was a very party-dominated system. They used to look at each other's ballots, I remember, at times, because there were some expulsions of Labor people for voting the wrong way around 1950 from memory. That's a party-dominated system, whereas you have something quite different, I think, in the nominated system before then.
time for just one more quick question. Keith?
Is there any indication that
There's a microphone.
Is there any indication that the Starmer government is looking at the Australian experience as it thinks what to do with the House of Lords?
Don't know.
I don't think so. No, I mean, I have been following the debates in the UK, and they seem to be very focused on their own experience and working out something that fits their own experience. I don't think they're looking at the Legislative Council of New South Wales. Sadly, you know, the imagination is rather narrower, I think.
Well, perhaps we can live in hope. That brings us to the close of this session. Can I ask you to join me in thanking Frank and Rodney? And we very much look forward to your continued participation over the next couple of days and your contributions from the floor. It's now time for a morning tea break upstairs in the Fountain Court. If you follow the directions of our colleagues, there's a wave of the hand there from Angela at the back, just upstairs in the Fountain Court. If you can be back here by 11:40 for the start of our next session, where we move from 200 years of political history to 200 years of legal and constitutional history. Thank you.